Isabel had conceived the desire to make a tour of the tough joints, and because I had some acquaintance with them, she asked me to be their guide. I did not much like the notion because in places of that sort in Paris they are apt to make their disapproval of sightseers from another world unpleasantly obvious. But Isabel insisted. I warned her that it would be very boring and begged her to dress plainly. We dined late, went to the Folies Bergère for an hour, and then set out. I took them first to a cellar near Notre Dame, frequented by gangsters in their miles, where I knew the proprietor, and he made room for us at a long table at which were sitting some very disreputable people. But I ordered wine for all of them, and we drank to one's health. It was hot, smoky, and dirty. Then I took them to Sphinx, where women, naked under their smart, taut evening dresses, their breasts, nipples, and all exposed, sit in a row on two benches opposite one another, and when the band strikes up, dance together listlessly with their eyes on the lookout for the men who sit round the dance hall at marble-top tables. We ordered a bottle of warm champagne. Some of the women gave Isabel the eye as they passed us, and I wondered if she knew what it meant. Then we went on to the Rue de Lep. It is a dingy, narrow street, and even as you enter it, you get the impression of sordid lust. We went into a cafe. There was the usual young man, pale and dissipated, playing the piano, while another man, old and tired, scraped away on a fiddle, and a third made discordant noises on a saxophone. The place was packed, and it looked as though there wasn't a vacant table. But the patron, seeing that we were customers with money to spend, unceremoniously turned a couple out, making them take seats at a table already occupied, and set us down. The two persons who were hustled away did not take it well, and they made remarks about us that were far from complimentary. A lot of people were dancing, sailors with the red pom-pom on their hat, men mostly with their caps and handkerchiefs around their neck, women of mature age, and young girls, painted to the eyes, bareheaded in short skirts and colored blouses. Men danced with podgy boys with made-up eyes. Gaunt, hard-featured women danced with fat women with dyed hair. Men danced with women. There was a frost of smoke and liquor and of sweating bodies. The music went on interminably, and that unsavory mob proceeded around the room, the sweat shining on their faces with solemn intensity, in which there was something horrible. There were a few big men of brutal aspect, but for the most part they were puny and ill-nourished. I watched the three who were playing. They might have been robots, or mechanical was their performance, and I asked myself if it was possible that at one time, when they were setting out, they had thought they might be musicians to whom people would come from far to hear and applaud. Even to play the violin badly, you must take lessons and practice. Did the fiddler go to all that trouble just to play for trots till the small hours of the morning in that stinking squalor? The music stopped, and the pianist wiped his face with a dirty handkerchief. The dancers slouched or slided or squirmed back in their tables. Suddenly, we heard an American voice. "For Christ's sake!" A woman got up from the table across the room. The man she was with tried to stop her, but she pushed him aside and staggered across the floor. She was very drunk. She came up to our table and stood in front of us, swaying a little and grinning stupidly. She seemed to find the sight of us vastly amusing. I glanced at my companions. Isabel was staring at her blankly. Gray had a sullen frown on his face, and Larry gazed as though he couldn't believe his eyes. "Hello," she said. "Sophie," said Isabel. "Who the hell did you think it was?" she gurgled. She grabbed the waiter who was passing. "Vincent, fetch me a chair." "Fetch one yourself," he said, snatching himself away. "Salute," she cried, spitting at him. "T'en fais pas, Sophie," said a big fat fellow with a great head of greasy hair who was sitting next to us in his shirt sleeves. "Here's a chair." "Fancy meeting you all like this," she said, still swaying. "Hello, Larry. Hello, Gray." She sank into the chair, which the man who had spoken placed behind her. "Let's all have a drink, patron," she screamed. I had noticed that the proprietor had his eyes on us, and now he came up. "You know these people, Sophie?" he asked, addressing her in the familiar second-person singular. "They're my childhood friends. I'm buying a bottle of champagne for them. And don't you bring me any urine de cheval. Bring me something one can swallow without vomiting." "You're drunk, my poor Sophie," he said. "To hell with you," he went off, glad enough to sell a bottle of champagne. For we, safety's sake, had been drinking brandy and soda, and Sophie stared at me dully for a moment. "Who's your friend, Isabel?" Isabel told her my name. "Oh, I remember. You came to Chicago once. Bit of a stuffed shirt, aren't you?" "Maybe," I smiled. I had no recollection of her, but that was not surprising, since I had not been to Chicago for more than 10 years and had met a great many people then and a great many people since. She was quite tall, and when standing looked taller still, for she was very thin. She wore a bright green silk blouse, but it was crumpled and spotted, and a short black skirt. Her hair, cut short and loosely curled but tousled, was brightly hennaed. She was outrageously made up, her cheeks rouged to the eyes and her eyelids, upper and lower, heavily blued. Her eyebrows and eyelashes were thick with mascara, and her mouth scarlet with lipstick. Her hands, with their painted nails, were dirty. She looked more of a slut than any woman there, and I had a suspicion that she was not only drunk but doped. But one couldn't deny that there was a certain vicious attractiveness to her. She held her head with an arrogant tilt, and her makeup accentuated the startling greenness of her eyes. Sodden with drink as she was, she had a bold-faced shamelessness that I could well imagine appealed to all that was base in men. She embraced us in a sardonic smile. "I can't say you seemed so terribly pleased to see me," she said. "I heard you were in Paris," said Isabel lamely, a chilly smile on her face. "You might have called me. I'm in the phone book." "We haven't been here long." Gray came to the rescue. "Are you having a good time over here, Sophie?" "Fine. You went bust, Gray, didn't you?" His face flushed a deeper red. "Yes." "Tough on you. I guess it's pretty grim in Chicago right now. Lucky for me I got out when I did. For Christ's sake, why doesn't that bastard bring us something to drink?" "He's just coming," I said, seeing the waiter threading his way through the tables with glasses and wine on a tray. My remark drew her attention to me. "My loving in-laws kicked me out of Chicago. Said I was gumming up their reputations." She giggled savagely. "I'm a remittance man." The champagne came and was poured out. With a shaking hand, she raised the glass to her lips. "To hell with stuffed shirt," she said. She emptied the glass and glanced at Larry. "You don't seem to have much to say for yourself, Larry." He had been looking at her with an impassive face. He had not taken his eyes off her since she had appeared. She smiled amiably. "I'm not a very talkative guy." The music struck up again, and a man came over to us. He was a tallish fellow and well-built, with a great hooked nose, a mat of shining black hair, and great central lips. He looked like an evil Savonarola. Like most of the men there, he wore no collar, and his tight-fitting coat was closely buttoned to give him a waist. "Come on, Sophie, we're going to dance." "Go away, I'm busy. Can't you see I'm with friends?" "To hell with your friends, you're dancing." He took hold of her arm, but she snatched it away. She's saying something in French I don't understand. I can't pronounce, but she's yelling at him about something. Gray did not understand what they were saying, but I saw that Isabel, with that strange knowledge of obscenity that the most virtuous woman seems to possess, understood perfectly, and her face went hard with a frown of disgust. The man raised his arms with his hand open, the horny hand of a workman, and was about to slap her when Gray half raised himself from his chair. He shouted with his execrable accent. The man stopped and threw Gray a furious glance. "Take care, Coco," said Sophie with a bitter laugh. "He'll lay you out cold." The man took in Gray's great height and weight and strength. He shrugged his shoulders sullenly and, throwing a filthy word at us, slunk off. Sophie giggled drunkenly. The rest of us were silent and I refilled her glass. "You living in Paris, Larry?" she asked after she had drained it. "For the present." It's always difficult to make conversation with a drunk, and there was no denying it. The sober are at a disadvantage with him. We went on talking for a few minutes in a dreary, embarrassed way. Then Sophie pushed back her chair. "If I don't go back to my boyfriend, he'll be as mad as hell. He's a sulky brute, but Christ, he's a good screw." She staggered to her feet. "So long, folks. Come again. I'm here every night." She pushed her way through the dancers, and we lost sight of her in the crowd. I almost laughed at the icy scorn on Isabel's classic features. None of us said a word. "This is a foul place," said Isabel suddenly. "Let's go." I paid for our drinks and for Sophie's champagne, and we trooped out. The crowd was on the dance floor, and we got out without remark. It was after 2, and my mind time to go to bed. But Gray said he was hungry, so I suggested that we go to Gaff's and Montmartre and get something to eat. We were silent as we drove up. I sat beside Gray to direct him. We reached the garish restaurant. There were still people sitting on the terrace. We went in and ordered bacon and eggs and beer. Isabel, outwardly at least, had regained her composure. She congratulated me, somewhat ironically perhaps, on my acquaintance with the more disreputable parts of Paris. "You asked for it," I said. "I've thoroughly enjoyed myself. I've had a grand evening." "Hell," said Gray. "It stank." And Sophie. Isabel shrugged an indifferent shoulder. "Do you remember her at all?" she asked me. "She sat next to you the first night you came to dinner with us. She hadn't got that awful red hair then. Its natural color is dingy beige." I threw my mind back. I had recollection of a very young girl with blue eyes that were almost green, and an attractive tilt to her head. Not pretty, but fresh and ingenuous, with a mixture of shyness and pertness that I found amusing. Of course I remember. I liked her name. I had an aunt called Sophie. She married a boy called Bob MacDonald. Nice fellow, said Gray. He was one of the best-looking boys I ever saw. I never understood what he saw in her. She married just after I did. Her parents were divorced, and her mother married a Standard Oil man in China. She lived with her father's people in Maugham, and we used to see a lot of her then. But after she married, she dropped out of our crowd somehow. Bob MacDonald was a lawyer, but he wasn't making much money, and they had a walk-up apartment on the north side. But it wasn't that. They didn't want to see anybody. I never saw two people so crazy about one another. Even after they'd been married 2 or 3 years and had a baby, they'd go to pictures and sit with arm around her waist and she with her head on his shoulder just like lovers. They were quite a joke in Chicago. Larry listened to what Isabel said, but made no comment. His face was inscrutable. What happened then? I asked. One night they were driving back to Chicago in a little open car of theirs, and they had the baby with them. They always had to take the baby along because they hadn't any help. Sophie did everything herself, and anyway, they worshipped it. And a bunch of drunks in a great sedan driving at 80 miles an hour crashed into them head-on. Bob and the baby were killed outright, but Sophie only had a concussion and a rib or 2 broken. They kept it from her as long as they could that Bob and the baby were dead, but at last they had to tell her. They say it was awful. She nearly went crazy. She shrieked the place down. They had to watch her night and day, and once she nearly succeeded in jumping out the window. Of course, we did all we could, but she seemed to hate us. After she came out of the hospital, they put her in a sanatorium, and she was there for months. Poor thing. When they let her go, she started to drink, and when she was drunk, she'd go to bed with anyone who asked her. It was terrible for her in-laws. They were very nice, quiet people, and they hated the scandal. At first, we all tried to help her, but it was impossible. If you asked her to dine, she'd arrive plastered, and she was quite likely to pass out before the evening was over. Then she got in with a rotten crowd, and we had to drop her. She was arrested once for driving a car when she was drunk. She was with Dago. She'd picked up in a speakeasy, and it turned out that he was wanted by the cops. But she had money, I asked. There was Bob's insurance. The people who owned the car that smashed into them were insured, and she got something for them, but it didn't last long. She spent it like a drunken sailor, and in 2 years she was broke. Her grandmother wouldn't have her back at Marvin. Then the in-laws, and they'd made her allowance if she'd go and live abroad. Suppose that's what she's living on now. The wheel comes full circle, I remarked. There was a time when the black sheep of the family was sent from my country to America. Now apparently he's sent from your country to Europe. I can't help feeling sorry for her, said Gray. Can't you? Said Isabel coolly. I can, of course. It was a shock, and no one could have sympathized with Sophie more than I did. We'd known one another always, but a normal person recovers from a thing like that. If she went to pieces, it's because there was a rotten streak in her. She's naturally unbalanced. Even her love for Bob was exaggerated. If she'd had a character, she'd have been able to make something of her life. If pots and pans, aren't you very hard, Isabel? I murmured. I don't think so. I have common sense, and I see no reason to be sentimental about Sophie. God knows, no one could be more devoted to Gray and the babes than I am. And if they were killed in a motor accident, I should go out of my mind. But sooner or later I'd pull myself together. Isn't that what you'd wish me to do, Gray? Or would you prefer me to get blind every night and go to bed with every man in Paris? Gray then came as near to making a humorous remark as I ever heard it. Of course, I'd prefer you to hurl yourself on my funeral pyre in a new Molyneux dress. But as that's not done anymore, I guess the best thing you could do would be to take the bridge. And I'd like you to remember not to go an original no trump on less than 3.5 to 4 quick tricks. It was not the occasion for me to point out to Isabel that her love for her husband and the children, though sincere enough, was scarcely passionate. Perhaps she read the thoughts that was passing through my mind, for she addressed me somewhat truculently. What have you got to say? I'm like Gray. I'm sorry for the girl. She's not a girl. She's 30. I suppose it was the end of the world for her when her husband and her baby were killed. I suppose she didn't care what became of her and flung herself into the horrible degradation of drink and promiscuous copulation to get even with life that had treated her so cruelly. She lived in heaven, and when she lost it, she couldn't put up with the common earth of common men, but in despair plunged headlong into hell. I can imagine that if she couldn't drink the nectar of the gods any more, she thought she might as well drink the bathroom gin. That's the sort of thing you say in novels. It's nonsense, and you know it's nonsense. Sophie wallows in the gutter because she likes it. Other women have lost their husbands and children. It wasn't that made her evil. Evil doesn't spring from good. The evil was there always. When that motor accident broke her defenses, it set her free to be herself. Don't waste your pity on her. She's now what at heart she always was. All this time Larry had remained silent. He seemed to be in a brown sturdy, and I thought he hardly heard what we were saying. Isabel's words were followed by a brief silence. He began to speak in a strange, toneless voice, as though not to us, but to himself. His eyes seemed to look into the dim distance of the past. I remember her when she was 14, with her long hair brushed back on her forehead and a black bow at her back. With her freckled, serious face, she was a modest, high-minded, idealistic child. She read everything she could get hold of, and we used to talk about books. When? Said Isabel with a slight frown. Oh, when you were out being social with your mother. I used to go up to her grandfather's and would sit under a great elm, and they had there and read to one another. She loved poetry and wrote quite a lot herself. Plenty of girls do that at age. It's pretty poor stuff. Of course, it's a long time ago, and I dare say I wasn't a very good judge. You couldn't have been more than 16 yourself. Of course, it was imitative. There was a lot of Robert Frost in it, but I have a notion it was rather remarkable for so young a girl. She had delicate ear and a sense of rhythm. She had a feeling for sounds and scents of the country, the first softness of spring in the air and the smell of the parched earth after rain. I never knew she wrote poetry, said Isabel. She kept it a secret. She was afraid you'd all laugh at her. She was very shy. She's not that now. When I came back from the war, she was almost grown up. She'd read a lot about the condition of working class, and she'd seen something of it herself in Chicago. She got on to Carl Sandburg and was writing savagely in free verse about the misery of the poor and exploitation of the working class. I dare say it was rather commonplace, but it was sincere, and it had a pity in it at the aberration. And that time she wanted to become a social worker. It was moving, her desire for sacrifice. I think she was capable of a great deal. She wasn't silly or mawkish, but she gave one of the impression of a lovely purity and a strange loftiness of soul. We saw a lot of one another that year. I could see Isabel listening to him with growing exasperation. Larry had no notion that he was driving a dagger in her heart, and with his every detached word twisting it in the wound. But when she spoke, it was with a smile on her lips. How did she come to choose you for her confidant? Larry looked at her with his trustful eyes. I don't know. She was a poor girl among all of you who had plenty of dough, and I didn't belong. I was there just because Uncle Bob practiced at Maugham. I suppose she felt that gave us something in common. Larry had no relations, but most of us have at least a cousin whom we may hardly know, but who at least give us a sense that we are part of the human family. Larry's father had been an only son, his mother an only daughter. His grandfather on one side, the Quaker, had been lost at sea when a young man, and his grandfather on the other side had neither brother nor sister. No one could be more alone in the world than Larry. Did it ever occur to you that Sophie was in love with you? Asked Isabel. Never, he smiled. Well, she was. When he came back from war as a wounded hero, half the girls in Chicago had a crush on Larry, said Gray in his bluff way. This was more than a crush. She worshipped you, my poor Larry. Do you mean to say you didn't know it? I certainly didn't, and I don't believe it. I suppose you thought she was too high-minded. I can still see that skinny little girl with the bow in her hair and her serious face, and who's trembled with tears when she read that ode to Keats because it was so beautiful, and I wonder where she is now. Isabel gave a slight start and threw him a suspicious, inquiring glance. It's getting frightfully late, and I'm so tired. I don't know what to do. Let's go.